Glad to have so many people joining on such short notice for this pop-up town hall about the president's Large Lousy Law, aka the Big Beautiful Bill, also known as the legislation that could devastate millions of American families. We're going to be getting into more depth as to those issues in a minute, and I think, all right, we have most of our participants loaded. Thank you very much for joining Congressman Krishnamoorthi's town hall tonight on the budget reconciliation package, which he's on the way back to Washington to vote on. For anyone wondering who hasn't heard already why the congressman is behind the wheel right now, um, unfortunately, due to storms around Washington, when the vote call came, Congressman Krishnamurthy was not able to take a flight back because they've been canceled. So he's on the way, driving all the way from the 8th District, from Schaumburg, all the way back to Washington, D.C., to vote against the president's budget reconciliation package. So that's the reason that the congressman will be making less eye contact than usual tonight, but is looking forward to answering your questions. In terms of asking those questions, because of our setup tonight, you can direct that in terms of written questions to me or the other panelists that we have identified. I'll screen those questions. I'll read them. We want to get to as many of your questions as possible. I may be combining some of the questions or just to cover ground more quickly. But to begin with, Congressman, what are your thoughts on this new version of the budget the Senate just passed?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. Can you hear me, Will?
Ken, you're coming through loud and clear.
Okay, very good. I'm sorry about this rather unusual means of conducting a town hall, but we've had so many inquiries about what is about to happen tomorrow that we thought, it's best to have a pop-up town hall. As some of you know, and as Will indicated, unfortunately, all of my flights are canceled or in the process of getting canceled because of severe storms. So we got some gas money, we got some snacks, and away we go to Washington, D.C. And so wish me luck in 14 hours. I'll be there. My GPS says I'm going to get there just in time, hopefully, for the 9 a.m. start of procedural voting and so forth. Okay, so the other side calls this the big, beautiful bill. I call it the large, lousy law. It's a horrible, terrible, just rotten law that they want to pass. And here's why. They basically want to extend tax cuts to the tune of $4.5 trillion, paid for by $3.3 trillion in debt and $1.2 trillion in cuts to the social safety net, including an astonishing $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid alone. Okay. I want to drill down on that for just one moment because that bothers me to the core. The $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid are going to leave directly 11 million people without access to Medicaid and probably another 6 million people without access to health insurance, including Obamacare, because a number of tax credits are going to lapse and they're not going to be extended. So we're talking 17 million people are potentially going to lose access to health insurance, including their health care. I think that's an unspeakable act. In addition to that, there are cuts to educational programs, housing programs, and of course, food stamps, now known as SNAP. And as many of you know, I am a child of food stamps and public housing and the social safety net. So this is a personal issue for me. Now, what can you do? And one of the reasons why we're doing this town hall, in addition to answering the questions of so many people who are kind of asking us about this, is it's also a call to action because you saw what happened in the Senate. Essentially, it was a 50-50 tie. 3 Republican senators joined 47 Democrats, and then J.D. Vance, the vice president, cast the tie-breaking vote. That's how close it was. I suspect the vote in the House is also going to be very close. So in addition to reminding me of why I'm going to be voting no on this particular bill, I'm hoping that you have friends and loved ones in other states and even in other districts, including in Illinois, and you remind your friends and loved ones of how important it is to keep the social safety net intact and why it would make sense for them to call upon their own representatives and senators, in this case, representatives, to vote against this bill because it's going to be super close. And we want to do everything in our power in the remaining hours before the vote to get people to vote no. No on this bill. No on the tax cuts for the wealthiest among us. And no on the trillions of dollars in additional debt that it's going to add to the nation's credit card. As it is, we're reeling under tremendous debt. This is going to only add to that debt. And I'll close with one thing. I believe that it may end up hurting Medicare in addition to Medicaid. And here's why. My good friend, who's the ranking member on the budget committee, Brendan Boyle, explained to me that there's something called sequestration laws. The sequestration laws are triggered when our nation's debt and deficit go above a certain level. And in this case, I believe the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, warned us that this rise above a certain threshold, which will trigger cuts to Medicare. So at the end of the day, I am imploring everybody. You could obviously be on Medicaid and be directly impacted. And for that reason, you should urge people to vote no. You could have a loved one that's affected by Medicaid. And I hope that you will then urge people to vote no. You could be somebody who just believes that it's immoral to take people's their health care away and their Medicaid away, and you will urge people to vote no. And if that doesn't move you, if those arguments don't move you, I hope that you will also urge people to vote no for the following reasons. One, I believe that it will also lead to cuts in Medicare, which affects all seniors and anybody who's planning to be a senior. And it will also close many hospitals throughout our country, including, I believe, upwards of 8 to 10 in Illinois alone, which will affect everyone, regardless of whether you're on private health insurance or you plan to visit one of the providers or healthcare providers for through some other means. You will be affected too. So everyone's going to be affected by this law. I'm going to stop there and allow people to pose questions because I know there are a lot, and I know there are hundreds of people who joined on very little notice. So I apologize for the lack of notice, but we had to we had to talk about this. So I'm going to kick it over to you, Will.
All right, and thanks to everyone who's sending in questions. We're going to try to get through as many as possible and work where it sort of overlaps. I'm going to combine some of these questions together. And Congressman, to clarify things, the Senate passed their version of this budget today, and what you're describing in terms of these Medicaid cuts, what was the relation between the House and Senate versions of it? Did the Senate expand those cuts and that impact on healthcare that we were already talking about from the House?
Yeah, in a word, yes. Believe it or not, the Senate Republicans actually made the Medicaid cuts worse, more severe. And one group, I'm just going to point out one group, but I could go. I don't want to get into too many of the details and bore everyone to death. But one group of people I'm also worried about are dual enrollees, people who are on Medicare but who also qualify for Medicaid because they are indigent, and as a consequence, they there's an estimate of about 1.2 million dual enrollees who will be adversely impacted, meaning they're going to lose their Medicaid benefits. While, so I mean, these are some and Medicaid just wrong. to me, it's cruel and it's wrong, and that's the reason why we have to vote against this.
All right. And thanks to the Congressman and everyone for bearing with us as some of the signal along the highway varies a little bit. Um, to jump into sort of a practical question, Congressman, you touched on this a little bit, but Jill Coberly wants to know, do you realistically think there will be enough votes against this bill to potentially stop it?
Um, so there's a 3 vote margin in the House, and I I really hope that we are able to muster our numbers. It's bizarre that these storms have now come up, but I think that we're going to get our full complement of people there. On the other side, they have they have 3 more votes than we do, and I know that I think Tom, Mr. Massey of Kentucky has already indicated he's going to vote no on this particular bill. So we need to pick off at least, I'd say, 3 more, at least 2 or 3 more Republicans. Okay. And I think that's doable. But of course, it's going to require courage. And we need some profiles and courage, but that's, as you know, a tall order. And that's why I think the book Profiles in Courage was such a slim volume. But there are a lot of people in districts that are going to be so adversely affected. They're going to have to choose whether they're going to be loyal to the president or they're going to be loyal to their constituents. And we need to hold them accountable. To me, there's only one answer. They have to be loyal to their constituents and put maximum pressure on them right now.
And to combine a few of those questions we have coming in, um, Congressman, what do you think is driving Republicans to vote yes? Is it a fear of Trump issue? Are there many of those sort of carve outs? For example, Alaska is sort of getting a free pass on some of these provisions because of Senator Lisa Murkowski, who is sort of on the fringe and was able to secure concessions. So Alaska is protected from some of the damage of this bill, as part of that side deal. Is it those sorts of agreements, or is it fear of the president, or what's really driving the support for this terrible legislation?
Um, if I had to be brutally honest, I think it's fear of the president. I think it is fear of somehow um, getting a primary challenge from the far right, uh, which the president would spark. As you know, Senator Tom Tillis voted no on this bill, and he had signaled that he was going to vote no. And that's when Donald Trump said he was going to find a primary challenger to Tom Tillis. At that point, Tom Tillis decided he needed to spend more time with his family, and he announced his retirement from the Senate. Um, I personally think he was going to spend more time with his conscience, and he just couldn't, in good conscience, vote for this bill. And look, I think there's going to be a moment of reckoning for people, which is, do they do what their constituents want, or do they do what Donald Trump wants? I hope they do what their constituents want, because you take health care from people, guess what? If you take their Medicaid away from them, they're going to become sicker, they're going to become poorer, and they're going to be less able to work. If the point of this bill is to get more people to work, well, if you take away their health care, they're not going to be able to work. And so I hope that people see the logic of that.
Congressman, can you speak to the impact that this legislation would have on rural hospitals, including in Illinois?
It's really interesting. I was just with somebody who talked about the rural hospital in their town. In their town, they basically have one hospital, and they literally have 1 or 2 doctors in that hospital. And many of these rural hospitals rely on Medicaid as the primary or one of the main kind of payers because they have so many Medicaid patients. If those Medicaid patients are no longer able to access Medicaid, to pay for their services, those hospitals will have to close their doors. And if that happens, these rural areas will be devastated. As it is, they're already on the brink in a lot of cases. So if you take away, further supports, they're going to close their doors. And at that point, you're going to have big medical deserts, essentially, in parts of Illinois, along with many other places in the country.
Congressman, to sort of a parallel point, we have a number of participants writing in mentioning family members who are veterans, who are in senior homes, who are on Medicaid, as well as pointing out that there are a lot of people on who have disabilities this July as we enter Disability Pride and Awareness Month. Um, a lot of those people will also be suffering and losing care under this law. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. I'm very concerned about all those groups that you mentioned, and we're not going to see. I mean, we can't anticipate all of the impacts, the cascading effects of this bill, but they're not good. And I would just add, it's going to impact all of us. It's not just a certain group of people. And so I hope that people keep that in mind. It's going to impact all of us negatively in some way. And so that's why I want everybody to raise their voice on this issue.
And Congressman, we're also getting some questions about the impact on clean energy, on wind, solar, other sources of clean energy that are being lost in this bill. And in the Senate negotiations, there was a time where they were actually going to start adding new taxes on solar and wind energy. That was pulled out. So they're not adding new taxes, but it is true that they got rid of a bunch of the subsidies that were passed into law. You've experienced in the solar sector. How concerned should people be about the impact of those cuts?
Oh my gosh, we should all be incredibly concerned. Why? Because as it is, the electricity grid and the supply of electricity is under great stress in this country. Why? In part because of the rise of data centers, and just the demand is increasing at a rate that we haven't seen until recently. But one of the saving graces is the development of renewable sources of energy, which have helped to deal with this demand. Well, guess what? If we get rid of these tax credits, the IRA tax credits, or we phase them out, essentially we're not going to be able to meet the demand for electricity, and prices are going to go up for all of us. Okay. And a much greater proportion of our electricity needs is going to be supplied by fossil fuels. All right. So we have two problems there. One, the price of household electricity bills is just going to go up. And two, we're not going to be combating greenhouse gas emissions, which is in part why the clean energy provisions were added in the Inflation Reduction Act. I should say the third thing, which is also going to happen, is we're going to lose jobs. We're just going to flat out lose jobs. There's so many projects that are now paused because people don't know whether they're going to pencil out or they're going to be viable as these tax credits start to get phased out. On top of that, you have these crazy tariffs, which are already making different components much more expensive for these different projects, and you're basically going to make them infeasible. So all the people that would otherwise have been employed, electricians, carpenters, laborers, so many different trades, but also engineers and others who are employed for these projects, are now going to be seeing economic uncertainty in their futures as well. So this is just such a loser. Today, I got word from the National Association of Building Trades that they believe that upwards of maybe 1 million jobs might be lost because of these clean energy tax credits being ripped out of our laws, and it's just so stupid. Like we are in a global competition right now, especially with the Chinese. Okay, the Chinese government is extremely aggressive. So if they are going to continue to be aggressive, and we are going to remove these tax credits, well, guess what? They are going to lead the way in innovation and creating prosperity and wealth for their country, while we are left in the dust. This is a stupid way to conduct business.
Congressman, we're getting some questions about education. In terms of the provisions to reduce Pell Grants, to potentially cut some lines in the Department of Education, in terms of those sorts of impacts, are you concerned about the economic effect that that may have for our students?
Yeah, it's okay. So the president of Eastern Illinois University came to my office. Very learned person, great administrator. He informed me that 20% of his students receive the maximum Pell Grant each year. And the maximum, I believe, is around $7,000 per year. That's the maximum. It's being lowered in this bill to $5,900. So basically, each of these students is going to see $1,100 less in their Pell Grant than they did last year. That is going, in his estimation, these people are not going to be able to complete their degrees because they're not going to be able to afford the difference of $1,100. These folks are coming from circumstances where they're $1,100 is a lot of money. Okay. And so what you're going to do is devastate their educational careers. Why? Because they're not going to be able to continue to be enrolled. So they're not going to be able to finish their degrees. And at the same time, many of them have taken on at least some debt to fund their educations. So they're not going to have a degree, and they're going to have debt. And so they're going to be left in horrible situations. So it doesn't make any sense. Again, if we talk about investing in our future, and this is the way that we are treating our students who are our future, then this bill fails on all counts.
Congressman Kel Gordon asks, are you concerned about how the bill will hurt women's rights in terms of what it's going to do by going after Planned Parenthood?
Yeah, this is crazy. So we just had a press conference at Planned Parenthood to talk about the provisions of the Large Lousy Law that affect Planned Parenthood of Illinois, a Planned Parenthood of Illinois. I'm just going to say PPIL for a moment. Okay, the Supreme Court has already allowed, through a case called Medina, individual states, to basically defund their versions of PPIL by denying Medicaid coverage for services provided at those organizations, even for non-abortion related services. As you know, many people actually receive their healthcare services from these entities having nothing to do with abortion, but having to do potentially with reproductive health care. I personally believe it's wrong for the federal government or any member of Congress to stand between a woman and her healthcare provider with regard to services involving her body. But in this particular case, they want to defund Planned Parenthood for all services. Okay, so that's where we start. That's the baseline. So today, the Supreme Court says a state could defund those organizations. Now, in this bill, the Large Lousy Law, they are basically defunding Planned Parenthood of Illinois and all similar organizations across the country so that they can no longer receive either Title X family planning services or Medicaid. Okay? So you're talking about basically removing 50% of the funding mechanism for most Planned Parenthood clinics including PPIL. That is devastating. Again, in Illinois, we're talking about maybe 30 to 35,000 people who will no longer be able to access those reproductive healthcare services at PPIL.
All right, Congressman, we're also getting some questions as to we're seeing these cuts all over the place. Who is benefiting from this? Where is the money going to?
Oh my gosh. It's basically the wealthiest among us. So I'll just give you an example, and I gotta go and look at the CBO numbers even more closely because they probably just updated the tables, the benefit tables, or whatever you call it. But my last reading showed that the top 1% of income earners get over $1 trillion in tax cuts. Okay. On the other hand, if you earn $50,000 to $60,000, you will see your benefits go down by hundreds of dollars. Okay. In other words, you will be paying more. You will be receiving less in services than you did before. That's wrong. It doesn't make any sense. It's reverse Robin Hood. And to me, that's un-American.
Congressman, what do you say to parents who rely on food stamps to feed their kids and are scared that those checks will stop coming if this bill becomes law?
3 million people are going to be experiencing reduced SNAP benefits in this country. 3 million. Can you believe that? Um, Again, I probably would not be here but for that social safety net, including public housing, including the SNAP benefits. We should never deny people food assistance when they're hungry. And to think that people will somehow be hungrier because of this bill, and to think that it could potentially affect children, um, it's alarming, it's disgusting, it's repulsive, and that's I think it that alone to me is an indictment of this bill.
Congressman, there's in terms of another agency and set of agencies that have funding coming their way. There's ICE, which is getting significant increases in funding towards its operations regarding immigration raids, etc. Can you speak to that?
Well, look, I don't think it's any secret that I have been. So let me just back up for a second. I believe in a legal immigration system that works. I believe in a secure border. I believe that we have to do whatever it takes to fix any problems that exist. But let's be clear. Immigrations and customs enforcement, ICE, I believe, has not conducted itself appropriately. When they send out text messages to hundreds, if not thousands of people on Father's Day weekend and before, asking people to come in to their ICE facility in the South Loop in Chicago to quote unquote check in. These are people who dutifully go downtown because they're trying to build their asylum case, they're trying to build their status, they're trying to get right with the law in some cases. And then ICE agents snatch them off the streets, separating them from families. That's wrong. That is wrong. That shocks the conscience to think that ICE agents would separate a father on Father's Day from his family after he reports in to try to just make things right in his immigration status, and he in an unsuspecting fashion reports downtown, then gets snatched off the streets. We weren't able to get any answers when we inquired about these situations. In fact, one of my caseworkers, she told me that she had been emailing and they just stopped responding to emails. Okay, so Jonathan Jackson, a fellow member of Congress, and we just go straight to this ICE facility in the South Loop, and we show up. At first, they didn't let us into the facility. Then we knocked on the door politely. They let us in, and a masked ICE agent greeted us. This guy refused to pull down his mask and identify himself. He refused to show his badge number, and then he called the CPD to evict us as trespassers from this facility. So I've now demanded from Secretary Noem to be able to inspect these premises. And in addition, when you talk about funding, we have to put restrictions on that funding if they're going to conduct themselves in this manner. And so that's another reason why I'm not going to support this bill, because I don't want a situation where we're funding a system that's not working. It's not working in the spirit that taxpayers want it to work, in my opinion, and the opinion of many people I talk to, Republicans, Democrats, Independents. They all, when I tell them this story, they are shocked by what they learn.
Congressman, to walk folks through this procedurally, not to get too deep into the weeds, but the House Budget Reconciliation Act, the bill we're talking about, started in the House. It was passed by a narrow margin in the House. Today, it just passed the Senate. What happens now? What are the steps between this and either stopping it or the bill becoming law?
Okay, so tomorrow morning we start votes. I'm told at 9 a.m. My GPS says I'm supposed to arrive by 8:38. So wish me luck. Only 757 miles to go, 12 hours and 34 minutes. Okay, so 9 o'clock, they're starting the procedural motions and what's called debate. Debate is where you get to go and, basically air your grievances with the bill. On the other side, of course, they'll air their support for the bill. But I'm hoping to be able to participate in the debate if I can get there in time. And after that, there will be a vote on the rule for the bill. That basically means the way in which the proceedings will happen. Then there'll be I don't know if they will get to final passage tomorrow. That's where I'm hoping you'll raise your voices. Because if you raise your voices and shine a light on the harm that's being done, if we can do enough, I'm hoping against hope that maybe 2 or 3 of the people on the other side will behave the same way that Tom Tillis and Susan Collins and others did in terms of maybe holding up the proceedings. And by the way, I'm going to digress for a second. When that happens, usually what we learn is that Donald Trump calls them to the White House. So I expect there's going to be high drama and the possibility that Donald Trump calls them to the White House and cooks them for like 5 hours through various diatribes and stuff like that. Hopefully they hold out. But if they relent and the brave then cave, that at that point there'll be final passage and then the bill, unfavorably. I mean, unfavorably from my standpoint, but favorably from the Republican standpoint, then it goes to the president's desk for signing.
All right. And Congressman, you spoke this a little bit, but we have a wide array of people asking what they can do about this, how they should speak to friends about this. And I think something that goes hand in hand with that people are asking about separately is what is appealing to this about a lot of the Republicans you speak to in terms of your colleagues, when you have colleagues who are on board with this bill, what do you think they're misunderstanding about it, or what is making them support it that you think is sort of misunderstanding the dynamics and the impact it will have? So, how can people communicate on this bill, and what is the sort of misunderstanding that's allowing this bill to get this far?
Look, I think there's so much information at this point out there, but let's just say that somebody is trying to operate in good faith. On the other side, they support this bill and they don't want to see they want to see those tax cuts or whatever. And they think that more people somehow are going to start working, and the effect, they're just going to get private health insurance, and they're not going to be affected in the way that we're talking about. People will not lose their health care. They'll just get health care in a different way through their employer. All I can say is 60% of people on Medicaid are already working. And so if 60% of people on Medicaid are already working and the Republicans are counting on savings, basically what is going to end up happening is that people who are already working are going to lose their Medicaid. That's the only way you can make sense of the magnitude of the cuts that they're counting on, the savings, because a lot of people are not going to have Medicaid that would otherwise have Medicaid. And if they're working, basically they're going to end up they're going to be working without their health insurance. I predict that those people are going to get sick and they're going to stop working as well. And so it ends up being counterproductive. So that's how I would approach it with people who might be operating good faith on bad assumptions on the other side, which is you're making bad assumptions about the people who are going to lose Medicaid. They're not going to be able to get health insurance. Why? Because they're already working and they're not getting health insurance. Otherwise, they wouldn't be on Medicaid.
Congressman, some people are asking about those sort of sequestration issues, which can sound, very complicated. But you spoke earlier about the fact that the debt issues with this bill could cause Medicare cuts. Can you speak to that a little bit more? And are you worried about protecting Social Security from the debt that this bill will bring?
I am. I think that what's going to end up happening is there's going to be a growing awareness, and we need to make it clear. By the way, that's another argument to bring up with people on the other side, and that is the cuts to Medicare that are likely to happen. Now, they're going to say, oh, we'll never let that happen. We will pass another law to prevent that from happening. Well, you know how easy it is to pass laws in Washington, D.C. And for one, don't want to necessarily count on the ease of passing legislation in Washington as the savior for why we're going to avoid cuts. I just don't think that that is really realistic. And I think that through some, whatever you want to say it, unintended consequences, intended consequences, we're going to see a cascade of problems happening because of this large, lousy law.
Congressman, to get a little bit lighter for a moment, we have a number of people wishing you very well on this long drive, making sure that you'll be taking some rest, that hopefully you have other drivers there that can take a shift with you. Dave Cave gave similar advice as a long distance driver, and we've had a few folks asking if you have any favorite driving songs and any driving snacks. And we will get back to policy in a minute, but I just wanted to throw that change of pace in there if you
I,
have any
I
thoughts
may
on.
ha- I may have to inflict the 80s and 90s on my passengers today. So, but I know that all of my constituents love the 80s and 90s. So I'm going to do the will of the people today, my friend.
I've been on mute. Congressman, do you think the rift between Donald Trump and Elon Musk, which has reemerged, especially over the clean energy subsidies, might be enough to stop this vote?
Um, I don't know. I don't understand that relationship at all. I would be merely speculating. But I did see that Elon Musk heavily criticized the bill because of the clean energy provisions being so dramatically and adversely affected. But I'm not seeing changes right now.
And Congressman, even if this bill passes, are there things that can be done at the state level? Do you feel like Illinois is doing what it can to help protect its citizens against the potential impacts of this law if it passes?
I wish I could say that Illinois could absorb these cuts, but I would be lying because most states, including Illinois, have what's called a trigger law, meaning that if the federal government decides to reduce its share of its burden sharing in the case of, for instance, these people who were added to Obamacare, as part of Obamacare, a lot of people were given coverage under Medicaid who previously were excluded. Okay, Illinois has a trigger law which basically says that if the federal government does not provide the level of funding necessary to get these people coverage, which is what this bill intends, then Illinois will automatically reduce its share as well because it won't be able to pick up the federal government share. So, I mean, we're really in a bind.
Congressman, a number of people have noted that the impact of this bill will take time to be felt because some of the cuts don't necessarily happen overnight. So it's going to be gradual. Um, what impacts are you expecting seniors and communities across Illinois to feel as those cuts come into effect? Do people with parents in senior homes who may be on Medicare and Medicaid have issues? People with relatives who are receiving state care, maybe for disabilities, physical or intellectual challenges? Can you speak to if this becomes law, what those impacts could look like?
Yeah, there are some, I think, delayed effective dates in part for political reasons, including I think they're delaying, I think, the effective date until after the midterm elections in 2026. But I got to tell you, like, I think the impacts will start immediately because if you look at let's say hospital systems, okay, I think hospital systems will have to plan. I mean, they make investments, hiring decisions, and the rest years in advance by forecasting. You know, what are their revenues, and if they know that within 18 months or whatever the number is, 2 years, they're not going to have these revenue streams. I fear that they're going to start downsizing. I fear that employees will start leaving if they're not asked to leave or they're downsized. I fear that some might even say, well, look, let's cut our losses now and let's close the doors. And in that case, it affects all of us because we rely on those institutions for our own care. I also worry about those nursing homes and other group homes that are somehow affected. Um, because as you know, a lot of Medicaid provides so much coverage for so many people for so many different types of services. So it has great reach beyond just strictly, you know, the types of healthcare that you and I think about. It affects behavioral healthcare, right? It's the primary behavioral healthcare payer for so many people. It affects, as you said, nursing homes. It affects 50% of all births in Illinois. Something between 40 and 50% of all births are funded through Medicaid. So it's going to affect, OB-GYNs, and it's going to affect all types of people who are in that space as well.
Congressman, we have a few questions about AI because there was the provision that was taken out during the Senate phase that would have put a 10-year moratorium on artificial intelligence regulations. Um, can you speak briefly about artificial intelligence in terms of this bill and what it means for our economy and how we should think about these attempts to prevent any regulation over AI?
I have a problem with that. Like, we just had a hearing about AI in which I pointed out that Illinois rightfully banned therapy chatbots for people. Believe it or not, there are AI engines that provide therapy and counseling to people as young as children, and the results of that therapy have been horrifying. I pointed out in one of my question lines, or maybe in my opening statement, that one therapy chatbot encouraged a child to kill his parents to make things better for him. That's the kind of craziness that Illinois was trying to regulate, rightfully so. And I think that what I'm concerned about with this bigger bill, and I want to read the details more carefully, is that it's going to basically snuff out certain regulations, such as this regulation or this law that was passed in Illinois, but also regulations with regard to deep fakes, regulations with regard to other aspects of AI that make sense. Um, I think that there was an attempt in the Senate to prevent uh, the law from basically um, preempting all state action. But I want to kind of go back and just read it more carefully to find out what the final language is.
All right, I'm turning to our final few questions here. Congressman, we have a question from Kay, who notes that her father was a master sergeant in Korea and that he's furious and embarrassed with the president calling up Marines by presidential directive to go to California against peaceful protesters. Can you speak to your feelings in terms of the president deploying U.S. military troops unilaterally against Americans who are practicing their right to protest?
So, can you hear me, Will?
I can repeat
Okay,
that as well.
I heard you. Look, um, first of all, I think that uh, peaceful protests should always be allowed, and we always want to encourage protests to be peaceful. But if for some reason they are not peaceful, then local law enforcement should be in a position and should take action to make sure it's peaceful. In this particular case, what Donald Trump did was, under the guise of the Insurrection Act, he called an emergency. He used his emergency powers to deploy active duty US military against fellow citizens. And that's wrong. In my opinion, and he did it without the consent or request of the governor or the mayor of Los Angeles in this case. I believe that that was it appeared to me to be a provocation. Okay. And so, me and Haley Stevens, a congresswoman from Michigan, and some others, we introduced a bill just a few days ago, which would essentially prevent a future president and this president from being able to deploy active duty troops against U.S. citizens without the consent of the chief executive of the jurisdiction. So in this case, it would be the governor of California, but it could be, in a territory, it could be the local chief executive. But the point is that the local authorities need to give consent. They need to be able to say, I'm just making this up, but they need to be able to say, look, either this is within our control, we can make sure that everything is taken care of, or they should be able to say, look, I need your support. It should not be done without their consent.
All right, as we've been going for coming up on an hour now, I think we're going to wrap up soon so the congressman will get back to his ride. But just to sort of close things out, Congressman, um, based on a lot of the questions we're getting, what would you say to folks in terms of, I guess you could say, your closing argument as to why to oppose this bill? And if you don't succeed, if these cuts go into effect, if these negative impacts happen, what should people think about the way forward? Does it mean giving up? Does it mean the battle's lost? So, what should they think about in the next 48 hours, 24 to 48 hours in terms of the votes? And if it doesn't go the way you hope, what should they think about at that point?
Okay, well, first of all, let's fight now. I mean, if you believe as I do that this is wrong and it's misguided and it's the opposite of what we should be doing, um, I hope that you will help to shine a light on it and try to get others aware and active. But if for some reason it doesn't go our way, um, there is an effect. I told you about the effective period. It's after the midterm elections. Well, guess what? This is not a political call. And I'm not asking you to do anything that is partisan. But if you're a Republican, Democrat, Independent, and you feel uncomfortable with this, I think it's time to hold people accountable. We may be able to stop this thing from going into effect by changing management and then at that point putting legislation in place that reverses this bill. Okay, I'm not saying that that's easy, and I'm not saying it's a path that's like my first choice or even my second choice, but that is what we're looking at here. And I hope that people use this as a teaching moment and a learning moment for democracy and why it matters and why we need to kind of take action both now but also afterwards if things don't go our way.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone who's joined today. We'll be posting a recording of this video online if you weren't able to join for the entire town hall or you want to share it with any friends or family. Congressman, before we wrap up and you focus fully on the road, any parting words?
Well, I'm actually driving through Illinois. I see a lot of cornfields. It's a beautiful state, and if there's any silver lining in this in what's going on right now, I get to enjoy Illinois and uh, I'm so glad to be with you, if even briefly. And I'm sorry it's under these circumstances. And I look forward to seeing you in person. Thank you for joining, and let's give it our all for tomorrow.
All right. Thank you, Congressman. Drive safe, and thank you, everyone, for joining this evening. Good night.